Well, good afternoon. Welcome back here to BVE 2015. We've got a fascinating 45 minutes ahead for you now. Really all about the art and science of lighting. We've got some very distinguished guests. Mr. Alan Roberts here, who will introduce himself in 1 second. We've got Thomas Urbye, who's a colorist, and Chuck Edwards from Cineo Lighting. Alan, tell us a bit about what you do for anyone who doesn't know who you are.
Well, where I came from, I'm a BBC research engineer. 37 years in research department at Kingswood, and then I discovered the escape tunnel and retired. That was 11 years ago. For about half that time, half that career, I was playing with color science, with cameras, HD, trying to get the best out of everything. Towards the end of it, I was advising production crews on how to go to HD. People pretty like Last of the Summer Wine. Spent several days up there, extremely happy, doing hardly anything and getting paid for it. It was wonderful. And that sort of carried on with testing cameras. All camera tests are now published by the EBU. But more lately, I've been testing lights because lighting is changing faster than cameras are changing. Yeah. And we need to do something about it.
Yeah. Thomas, you're a colorist. Tell us kind of what you do.
Well, we work on a variety of different content, ranging mostly from high-end drama to feature films. Most of the material we get will come from the Arri Alexa or the Dragon. They seem to be the main cameras. And my role is obviously to create beautiful images. It's as simple as that. So be able to recreate what the DP intended, what the director intended, and to fix any issues that might have come up on
We may
set.
come back to fixing issues. Chuck, tell us about yourself.
My background is digital imaging and displays. Quite a bit of experience in material science as well. So I'm working on developing LED light sources that create a full spectrum of light, something similar to tungsten and daylight, and also with the intention to enhance the image, to get better image quality.
Now, I want to start with this notion of CRI. We often see CRI banded around by a lot of manufacturers, saying that it's 90 and above, therefore it's brilliant. Can you explain why CRI isn't actually relevant to digital imaging?
Yes, I think Chuck can do this just as well as I can. The CRI was developed in the 1960s as a means of measuring the color performance of lighting for architectural purposes. Lighting buildings, offices, shops, factories, railway stations. As such, it does a reasonably good job, or rather it did in 1964 when it first came out. But now it doesn't. And it doesn't because the color industry's moved on a long, long way.
Now, Chuck, obviously, as a manufacturer, when everyone was kind of building regular LED fixtures with 200 LEDs in a panel, you were doing something different. Tell us about your route and why you did that.
So, most traditional light emitters are what they call black body emitters. Basically, they're a heater. You're heating up a filament, and it gets so hot it glows. And when it glows, you actually don't get to pick what color it is. It glows whatever temperature. So the temperature is actually really its temperature. LED is completely different. LED, you actually have an energy source, and you add phosphor and you tune the light. You're actually mixing it like paints to develop the color you want. So the great thing is you can mix it to do anything, but the problem is they're often incomplete. An inexpensive light or a light where they try to be more efficient, they'll skimp on some of the colors, and they'll actually not have a full set of color. So what we do at Cineo is we try to develop a light specifically for film and broadcast that captures a full range of light that the camera responds to. And to point on CRI quickly, CRI is about what people see, but it has nothing to do with what cameras see. And so a CRI is actually a rating intended for a consumer, an observer who's just sitting in a room with light. Has nothing to do with what a digital camera would record. And so it's really not a good unit of measure at all for our industry.
Well, I want to bring Thomas in here because obviously you're not on set. You're given rushes that have been completed and you're sitting in a colorist room with a graded monitor system making everything work. Now, you mentioned just before we came on air that, generally speaking at a high-end drama level, you don't have too many major problems. But how important is consistency of lighting for you as a colorist?
Well, a lot of the stuff we do is kind of been shot by very, very experienced DOPs with a lighting truck that's, of the kind of best standard that's affordable to that particular budget. But of course, we do work as well that is at the lower end of the industry, and you can very quickly run into problems if people have had to use a light source that they necessarily didn't want to have to use or choose. And you run into problems with trying to key skin tones. I mean, that's the reality of poor lighting. If you run into a mix, you could end up with pink foreheads and yellow cheeks, and I think any cameraman or even DP that has worked on jobs that they've compromised will end up in the grading suite, and there'll be issues trying to get those to match. And it is actually quite hard if you end up with, because the brain is very attuned to seeing the skin tones of something, or if the color of someone's jeans are just too, and I was looking at them onto there, and their mind are coming up really, really blue. I mean, it's not natural. So if the lighting is causing an unnatural look within the image, then that has to be fixed. And so the cost implication down the line at paying hundreds of pounds per hour to sit in the suite with me could be quite seriously negated by the fact of not just investing in a better quality lighting at the front end. And it could be that they initially had a particular post house or colorist on board that was very cheap or cost effective or whatever. That person isn't able to do it for whatever reason. There's a big fallout. Then they have to call a more experienced post house or a colorist, and then it's into thousands of pounds. And I'm sure hiring
and
the
the
light
issue I would imagine
is
is with mixing LED and conventional sources, be it HMI, daylight, and tungsten. I mean, Alan, you must have a lot of experience with all the testing you've done.
Yeah, I've been testing quite a lot of lights, actually. I've tested literally hundreds. Here is the list. This lot is published online. This is simply the list of everything we've done so far. And I have another list about the same length as this, which is experimental stuff, prototypes, stuff that is not yet for publication. So the interesting thing is we started off this measurement game thinking that it would be the distributors who'd be most interested, followed by the practitioners, the people actually making programs. But it's not, it's manufacturers. Because the manufacturers are all keen to make lights that are actually good before they get the bad reputation for making the bad lights. Yeah. Most of them.
Well, Chuck, I mean, as a manufacturer, I regard Cineo to be up at the higher end because of the products you make and the legacy of the company. There's obviously a lot of manufacturers at the middle and lower end who make vastly outrageous claims at times. How important is it for you as a manufacturer to have someone like Alan doing this level of testing, and I mean, how does that affect your business?
I think it's critical. I think all tungsten lights emit basically the same light. The quality of the fixture may be different and the optics may be different, but the fundamental light that comes out of all tungsten is the same. But with LED, that's just saying the kind of chip they used has nothing to do with what light is coming out of it. Yep. And unfortunately, every manufacturer can actually create a completely different formulation and give a completely different spectrum of light. It's the first time that's happened. So now you have a light source, we're saying 3200K light source doesn't really mean anything as far as the light shape. So characterizing them and saying both are they accurate, and then the other is are they attractive, are they beautiful? We were joking last night at dinner, you could measure if a woman's face is symmetrical, but that doesn't tell you if she's beautiful. And the same is true of a light source. You want it to both be accurate, but you also want it to be beautiful and render well on camera. And those are the two issues that have to be tested.
Well, that comes down to lighting tests, like camera tests then now. Yes, I mean, exactly. DPs are in it. I mean, I do camera tests all the time, and they're really dry and very dull. But people choose lenses. They choose the camera depending on, they do costume tests and everything, makeup tests. So I guess as you move to this world, then they have to introduce yet another test, which is if they do want to use this type of lighting, then they need to go and test that as well.
So obviously we can point a camera format at a subject and light it with different light sources, but of course different camera manufacturers have different chips, and light responds differently there as well, doesn't it?
You would think so, but in practice there's not that much difference between them.
Oh, really?
I had a long session with Chuck in the Chinese restaurant last night and showed him all the data for this. To set up the measurement algorithm we've got, we decided that we would do everything mathematically. I've got a block diagram of the whole thing here.
Which, again, is where you come in with your history.
There's a block diagram of it.
So here's,
do the whole thing
let's see if we can get this up on the camera here, guys. I don't know if you can see that, or we can get close up. That's a mathematical equation of how you're doing your measurements.
Yeah, exactly. That's a block diagram of the system. But inside each of these boxes are parameters that exist in ordinary existing cameras and displays. It's just that we need to formalize them so that it's a standard. And this first box, which is the responsivity curves of the cameras, we had no real data. And the manufacturers wouldn't give us data for their cameras. They thought it was proprietary. So we got hold of several of the top-end broadcast cameras at the time. This is in 2012. And measured them. in Oslo. And it was a process that took about 3 months. You take a camera into a lab and through a piece of equipment that hadn't worked since the late 1960s, was dragged out of the cupboard and resurrected, changing a few capacitors in power supplies and whatever. It all worked. And we got measurements of the spectral response curves of all of these cameras. Retested some cameras, tested more models of the same camera to make sure we were right. Ended up with about a dozen sets of curves for about a dozen different cameras, which all overlaid each other surprisingly well. You would agree with that, Chuck? You would agree that the curves overlaid each other reasonably well?
Yep.
Yeah.
And so there's a basic
yeah,
space standard.
But the thing that surprised us immensely was that the shape of the curve hadn't changed since the 1970s, when we were using Plumbican tubes rather than CCDs and CMOS. So the actual requirement of the camera hasn't changed. The way of doing it has changed, but the result is always the same.
So therefore we can safely make a small assumption that the cameras are all basically the same.
Yes.
So what changes is the light source that's hitting the subject matter.
Right.
And that has an impact very much on what you end up working with.
Well, yeah, because of course, actually, on a monitor and in a grading environment, every camera is different. And actually, there is a huge difference between something like the Arri Alexa and a lower budget camera, also including how much you'd be able to fix any potential problems. So if you are using a fairly high-end camera, then me being able to pull a key from a 10 plus bit source rather than a sort of 8-bit 420 or 4, you know, whatever it might be, codec is a huge game changer. And you would really struggle to fix issues on a lower end camera. So it comes back to the same story really, is that I always say to people, if you're shooting on a lower end camera and you're shooting straight to ProRes, then you need to be a lot more careful with your lighting on set, because you will have less control later. So it's almost sometimes the inverse of what you might hope it would be. Use cheap cameras, get your lighting set, because once you've set it, you're going to find it harder to
And what
to
we're
fix
talking
problems.
about here really is optimal working
right.
conditions. So optimal light level for the sensor you're working with and the lighting you're looking to do. So talk to me about the TLCI scale. This is a scale that you've helped to develop.
The TLCIs, it measures a camera, or rather, it measures a light source using a spectroradiometer. This is the one I use. They're not big and expensive. In terms of my pocket money, it's big and expensive, but it's, in scientific terms, it isn't. That produces the spectral response of a light source, such as this, the wavy line, and we calculate the performance and give a set of results which have been checked by colorists in London and in Oslo. So we have a scale from 0 to 100, which fundamentally is anything up to 30, forget about it. Anything above 90 is perfect, you won't need to do any correction. In the middle, about 50, it's hard to get very much of it right at the same time. And above and below it's reasonably evenly distributed. But these are the opinions of colorists, not my opinions. By a strange coincidence, they agree precisely with what I intended to do in the first place. So we got it right, basically.
Well, it's because, you know, Thomas, you'll be sitting in the suite getting this footage, and you're dealing with what's been given. You have no idea well, you know it's been shot with, but you don't know what it's been lit with.
No, not unless there's a problem.
Yeah.
In which case, and if the DP attends, then you can obviously have those conversations. I mean, the producers won't know either. So a directors probably won't either.
Yeah.
So you run into problems in that regard. This sort of thing won't come up unless something's gone wrong, I would say, because certainly at the higher end of the market, you're just not going to run into
Well, I imagine
those
the higher
problems.
end.
What I will just say quickly is that there will always be an occasion within, you know, every drama or film I've graded, or commercial, there has been scenes within a film where something didn't go right. And that is when problems will arise, and that's where the conversation comes up. It could be a lens choice, but it could also be lighting.
And I mean, this might be a tough question, but can you think of any situations where there's been an issue because of a light source?
Yeah, and sometimes it will just be that, I think, you know, as the gentleman was talking about there, is that this idea of measuring and the idea of a color temperature, it becomes a problem, will be where someone has used a fill light that just does not quite match the rest of the lighting within the room. And I don't need to give a specific example. I know that that happens, and then we're back into keying secondaries, and suddenly you get pink here, or you'll get green here, or yellow here.
Because it's difficult to blend in.
And it's a problem, because that's what the audience is looking at. They're not looking at the back of the set, they're looking at what's happening here. So that is a problem.
So let's talk about, sorry.
Quick question, how often in post-operation do you get the DOP sitting in?
Probably 70%. Well, on a drama and a feature, 70 to 80% of the time.
Good.
On commercials, 40% of the time, and in other type of content, corporate or whatever, then 20%. It's very low.
Okay. So
Yeah.
basically, the more that is being spent on the production, the more the DOP is going to stay
Yes.
in touch with the whole process.
Yes, and also
That's
their
good
agent
news.
expects them to be paid.
Exactly.
So this it all comes down to money.
Yes.
DPs won't be able to necessarily take a week out of their schedule
That's right.
to attend a grade if they're not being paid for it, because
Sure.
obviously they'd rather be earning more money, and on some productions they just will not
Well,
pay
let's talk
the
about
rate.
some of the technology. I want to bring you in, Chuck, and talk about remote phosphor, because you, as a company, pretty much pioneered this notion of removing the phosphor from the lamp itself and creating that distance. Talk us through the development of that and why you went down that route.
Well, I think you brought up an interesting point as well. The monitor is the only place you really are seeing what's getting captured on set, especially because the testing you've done and what we've seen with light sources is the way the camera responds to the light is very different than you actually see the light.
Yes.
So the camera actually captures a wider spectrum than the human eye does. And so like you're saying, you'll get green highlights or red highlights captured on a camera that you'll never see just looking at the person if you're lighting them. So what we're trying to do is create a light source that understands that and adds, for example, a lot of the deep red near IR that a camera sees that a human doesn't see. That's why often an LED source in particular will come across as green heavy on camera, but looks fine when you're looking at it in the room. And that's because the eye doesn't match the camera sensitivity.
Yes.
And especially the high-end cameras have this ability to kind of expand the gamma of color they capture. And so in our job, it's to try to develop light that actually mimics what the camera expects to see and mimics the way that tungsten works with the camera or daylight works with the camera.
Yeah.
And so that's kind of our job and why we're working on programs like this with Alan to try to make sure our lighting is geared towards that application, not just general lighting or how people see it.
So this might seem like a simple question, but if anyone is watching who's not familiar with how remote phosphor works, talk us through how the process works with your technology.
I'm sorry, I didn't.
Can you just explain how remote phosphor works as opposed to conventional LED?
So
I've got some examples if you want them.
the hard part for most people to appreciate is LEDs are actually only blue. So when they invented the LED for white lighting, they only made a blue LED. They can't make a white LED. So then they take phosphors and they actually add phosphors, actually green phosphor, yellow phosphor, red phosphor, and they build up white light off of a yellow base. So if you ever see an LED off, it always looks kind of a yellow-orange color. That's actually the phosphor sitting on top of the blue LED. So what we're doing is we're actually building a full spectrum of light. So for example, you'll see a peak here, which is the blue light that came off the LED. All of the rest of this color is being developed by mixing different phosphors. And that's up to the decision of the developer, the light developer. And that's what we do. We try to actually custom develop a spectrum that the cameras would use. And we develop a spectrum specifically for daylight and a spectrum specifically for tungsten and for 4300.
And the advantage of your lighting is that you've got the blue LED base, but you can swap out the phosphors to create different color temperatures.
Exactly, so we put it on a whole panel. So the blue LED is an energy source, and then you slide in the color you want. So you can slide in a tungsten panel or a daylight panel. The same power supply, the same LEDs power those panels. Actually, the panel is the light source, not the LEDs anymore. So
and Alan, you were
different
explaining
approach.
just a moment ago that this light here from Aladdin is the same concept.
Absolutely the same.
phosphor is just simply strapped onto the LED itself.
Yeah, absolutely the same concept. Here there are 10 LEDs. Actually, there are 3 LEDs inside each package, and there's a layer of phosphor which looks yellow on reflection, but you turn it on and you get white light.
And of course the difference with this is that if you want to change the color temperature of this light, you start to use gels and other filters. Whereas it's your technology is you can put in a 4300
Different phosphors.
phosphor if you want to.
Yeah.
Actually, it's almost impossible to do with gels to go
Yes.
from daylight.
Yeah.
So
It is.
You'll notice that they actually have 2 sets of LEDs.
Yeah.
One that has the daylight phosphor on it, one that has the tungsten phosphor on it, and they have to turn the one set off and turn the other set on.
That's right.
And that's because traditionally, especially at the lower end of the LED market, when you start to color correct using gel, you run into all sorts of problems, don't you?
Well, that's why Lee and the other companies are making filters have developed special lines of gels to deal with LED sources. they sort of work, but they don't do entirely what they're intended to do, because physically they can't, because all the LED sources are different.
Yeah. So in the testing you've done, talk me through some of the surprises, talk me through some of the real shocks, if you can.
The big surprise is that you can't believe the price on a unit. The price on a unit often tells you nothing about how good it is. For example, yesterday I measured a small light on the hold-on stand. I don't want to advertise, but it scored rather remarkably high for its price. On other stands I've seen the same price equipment that doesn't work at all well. There really is no rhyme or reason to this.
And I've noticed in some of the lower cost fixtures that sometimes they can look okay at the daylight end, but as soon as you go down to tungsten, they can look very, very green.
That's because the light sources tend, as Chuck has said, you tend to have what's called a bicolor device. So you have a tungsten source and a daylight source, and you simply do a crossfade between the two to get the colors in between. So if one of those two end sources is not as good as the other end, then you're going to have different performance as you do a crossfade.
So it's very difficult for consumers to know what to believe.
Absolutely. The consumer has no chance. Unless you do spectral testing, measure the spectrum and do the sums, you have no idea what it's going to do. You cannot even just look at the spectral power distribution and say whether it's going to be a good source or not. It's not that simple. You have to do the analysis.
Which is what gets why manufacturers like yourself work closely with people like Alan to try and make sure people are educated.
Agreed, but there's also the colorist point of view, which I think is even more critical. When DPs used to pick film, it wasn't about what was the most accurate film, it's what's the most attractive film.
Yes.
What captured an image and made it beautiful. I've noticed most of the people developing digital cameras today that are really successful came out of the film side. They're not trying to make the most accurate color measurement instrument, they're trying to make a camera that captures a beautiful image. And the same's got to happen with lighting. It's important that we have metrics and understand if the data's there, but then there's a step above that, which is it a beautiful light? Is it a light that people want to see? And especially, does it render flesh tones and faces in a way that's attractive and people want to see it?
This conversation is very similar to what goes on in monitor technology.
Yes. It's identical.
Because we're in the same, we are in a changeover where clients will say to me, oh, I just really missed the look of my CRT, and what, should I buy an LCD, an LED, or wait for OLED to be more cost effective? Should I get 4K and everything else? And the reality is that some clients come in, and we have a couple of plasmas, which I don't really like very much because they flicker and there's all sorts of problems with their low bit rate. But clients go, oh, it looks really nice on this screen, doesn't it? It's a little bit softer. This is a bit more like a CRT. And so all these issues tend to come in. And so regardless of how I measure viewing angle, black level, all this type of thing, it's very difficult when you have this changing in technology. You have to decide as a DP, which ultimately is the decision maker, what is the best tool in terms of choosing the lighting that you can possibly have on set. We mentioned before we started filming about the quality of the monitoring in the absence of quality testing, and also like Chuck was saying there, is that on set, one thing that I realize in a monitoring environment, even though I do go onto set, is it's very quick, it's very easy for people on set to their brain to automatically correct the imbalances that is actually happening on set. I remember working on a show with a particular DP who said, well, we wanted to have a green fill. We went far too far because we'd set the scene up, we wanted to go further, and what was happening was everyone in the room was correcting the fact there was so much green by the human eye. Having a monitor there would have helped, a properly calibrated monitor. And so in a production where people try and skimp on having a decent Sony OLED or something like that could be very dangerous to your production later on, because if you had a proper Rec 709 monitor calibrated, then you would be able to pick up on some of these issues of skin tones before it comes through to us, rather than just looking on something like the Blackmagic camera, which is a great little camera, but you cannot make a judgment on the back of that has a terrible viewing angle issue, because I've used it on set to make a decision about what you're actually getting on those skin tones on a big screen.
Yeah, there is no substitute for good monitoring.
Absolutely,
at all points in the production.
Has to go hand in hand if you're making decisions on changing your technology of the way you've lit for the last 50 years as a DP, or 30, or however long you've been lighting, and you suddenly say, right, we're going to go with these LED because I went down to the BVE show and saw some amazing stuff. Let's just have a go with these guys. I like the manufacturer. Dave's going to send me some lights. That's a pretty risky decision, because it's still your career. And then when the producer says, oh, we've got a problem and we're in the grading suite, it's not looking great, or the finger points back at you.
You see it especially on a lot of television news and breakfast telly, any kind of regular non-high-end budget TV has color over the place, because you can just tell, especially news crews have used cheaper LED 1x1 panels and just, then you can see the color casts.
Yes, but news is a different game. News is done down to a price. It's often done by, the footage is often contributed by stringers, or you may be using their own kit. Under those conditions, you accept the footage if there is no other way to get it. And there is never any time to put it right because you need the news now, not in 5 minutes' time. I've been in a news studio where footage has come in during the actual broadcast, and the script for the rest of the program has been rewritten 4 times for 15 minutes.
Yeah.
News is a different game. We can never get news right unless we insist that everybody uses high quality lighting of the same grade as
you were
studio.
saying, the price isn't necessarily the indication of quality. And I know I'm on a couple of cameraman forums, and they'll discuss the price of a 1x1 panel because they don't want to pay for light panels, for example. And actually, what you've discovered is that in testing, not every cheap panel is bad.
Correct.
But there's a problem because people are buying lots of different manufacturers, and we're seeing lots of inconsistencies in a lot of TV.
The only way to find out what you're buying is to test, or to rely on somebody else testing, and that's what I do.
Yeah.
And also you'll find that DPs will make a decision on what they like particularly. There's going to be the aesthetic, and they will just feel that for their type of lighting, a particular manufacturer will be closely aligned with the way that they want for their images to look. I don't think that's really changed. I guess, not as someone who's not involved in this field, I suspect that there's anything that involves LED or any of that type of technology probably opens up more of manufacturers, and so you probably end up with even more people manufacturing LED lighting. Chinese whispers of some DP on a forum saying this one looked really good. It comes back to the same thing, just your own judgment, go and do your own tests, get aligned with a particular manufacturer that you have a good rapport with, I would suspect, these guys may correct me, but then go and do your own test on the camera that you like to use, so that when you turn up to set, you could say, look, I feel like I've got a great feeling with this, I've seen it way through post, I've done a little bit of grading on Resolve myself as a DP, and I'm happy with the results. I will stick by this decision.
And if possible, and the budget allows, go and align yourself with a colorist who can actually run that workflow test right from acquisition through to delivery.
And if we've won a job on a major series or a film, then we'll happily do those tests at the beginning. It's obviously a bit different if someone's just doing it for their own portfolio. Sometimes that's probably a little bit late for them because everyone do it earlier on, but it comes back to the same thing, isn't it? Align with people like that sat either side of me and build a rapport with a company that you've had a long relationship with, and get out there and test some stuff on. It could be a Blackmagic camera, to be honest with you. They're absolutely fine as well, just to get an idea of how the response curve is with that particular camera and the lighting that you are thinking of using.
You just said something very important. It's a trust relationship that you have to have with the manufacturers and suppliers. So you have to trust that a manufacturer is not going to change the internal design of a product partway through its production line.
Yes.
Unless he changes the name of it, or puts a version 2, Mark 2 or whatever.
Because changing a chip or changing a
it
dial
changes things dramatically. I have come across this several times, where 2 of us testing the same luminaire in different countries have produced different results. And the reason has been because the design has been changed partway through, but we didn't know.
And interestingly, when I look at your products, there's a fairly meaty ballast with a lot of electronics in it. You compare other panels that don't have any electronics in them. I'm guessing there's a reason why there's so many electronics in your ballast.
Well, I mean, so every company is trying to take their own direction with their panel and how they do their color mixing and color blending. I think the panels, just like the cameras, have an interesting problem. In the old days, you change the film, and that changed the color of the camera, basically. Everybody knew that it was the emulsion that actually decided the color of the camera. So now it's the sensor. The sensor is equivalent, changing the sensor is equivalent to changing the emulsion. And then on the light source, now what's happening in LED is it's not like a traditional source. Every brand of LED is actually going to give you a different spectrum of color. So in your profession, you're going to be in a situation where you'll have to take a specific camera with a specific sensor, and if you're using LED, a specific LED, and those will have a pairing, and they'll give you a certain image. And if you change one or the other, you could get a very different result, even though both are LED and even both are digital.
But what we have found in measuring the cameras is that the responsivity curves hardly change from camera to camera. So it isn't the sensor. It's not the sensor that's doing it. It's the way the camera is set up, the controls.
Interesting.
And that's the other thing that I do, which is test cameras and find the best setup to produce pictures that I like. I've tested hundreds, and they're all published. So if you're telling me that different cameras produce different looking results, it can only be because they've been set up differently.
Oh yeah, I'm sure that is the case. And obviously the final result, as we talked about, the codecs, is a big change.
Oh,
I mean,
that's a
that
big
has
change.
a huge impact.
That's a massive
regardless
change.
of what the chip is.
Yes.
That, for me, is usually half the problem.
Yeah.
It's what you get out the back from, you know, from
How
where
much
they
meat you've got
got
left to work with.
And if we
Yeah,
go,
absolutely.
if you're going up towards 4K, we know that we're going to be transmitting 10-bit, not 8-bit.
Yeah.
So we know we're going to have to be acquiring at least 12, if not 14-bit. Your life is going to get really interesting in a few years' time.
I have to spend more money on kit.
Absolutely.
It's generally how it works.
Yes.
Is there a difference lighting for 4K?
No, there isn't. It's exactly the same. The sensor's exactly the same. What's different is the way the data will be processed.
Right. And
So all these results will apply to 4K equally well.
and what are the real challenges with 4K as a colorist? Are there any differences between 4K and HD?
You know, the 4K conversation is quite complex. But in a nutshell, you've got people fighting, DPs and directors fighting a move to 4K because a lot of them don't feel that it is romantic enough. And there's obviously a cost implication from a post-production point of view and a production point of view about the amount of data that you might get through. Shooting, you know, a raw format at 4K is going to get very, very expensive in terms of post and the amount of drive space. So one thing that seems to be quite ironic is, of course, we are moving to higher resolutions but using older glass because people want the aberrations around the outside. And I sit on various panels and it always comes back to the same old thing. Ultimately, in storytelling, quite often you're telling something that's romanticized. It's like wearing sunglasses and remembering a summer where it was great, where you just had a really romantic summer or whatever. You suddenly put that in the cold light of 4K, what that summer was really like, and it maybe wasn't quite as romantic as you initially wanted it to be. So 4K is very much a decision that needs to be taken quite carefully.
Absolutely right.
And resolution quite often tends to go up and other things can get compromised, like color sampling and all these other things, you know. And so these cheap cameras that say they're 4K, I would pick the Alexa at HD ProRes over any cheap domestic camera that aforementioned Japanese cameras manufacturers state is 4K for £3,000.
Yeah.
Nonsense.
And it's one of these things. I mean, we come to all these trade shows year in, year out. You know, it's kind of it's driven by camera manufacturers, isn't it? 4K has been driven by camera manufacturers and panel manufacturers.
Yeah.
I think the 4K is not driven by the camera manufacturers, it's driven by the display manufacturers. They want to sell more TV sets.
Well, sometimes the same.
Yeah.
Sony and Panasonic, obviously.
Yeah. But fundamentally, I think the 4K is now being driven almost entirely by the display makers.
Yeah.
And we are doing 4K. We do 4K for big screen events, which are very popular now. We mustn't forget the 4K projection, and we're doing a major project at the moment, which will be shown in the Middle East on a huge screen. So it is happening in that world, but I still don't quite personally see the value of 4K for television broadcast. I think the HD on a screen that's 50 inches and you're sat 4 meters away, I'd be surprised if you could tell the difference. Certainly by the time it's been so heavily compressed by whoever it is. So HD, I think, is great for television, and 4K is for the big screen environment at your 8 meter screen plus, where you would really see the difference.
So let me just come back to a bit more lighting. You know, the fact that I think one of the biggest challenges, probably for colorists more than anything, is when you find these mixed lighting situations. You might have a bit of daylight coming into the room, an HMI coming in the window, plus some LEDs. What kind of problems can that cause if they're not matched up correctly?
A mess. A complete mess, yeah. And what you're back into, as I said earlier, this idea of secondary color correction, which is pretty miserable for everybody in the room. It's quite funny because you have the grading suite is almost like this sort of slightly, everyone always says, oh, this is the best bit of the process because you can just relax and all the clients can just sit back and enjoy it. So it's like, and a lot of the time it's a really enjoyable experience. It's been properly lit and probably, photographed, and everyone has a great time. At the moment you introduce obviously a mix of lighting, you could, come into problems. I think that comes back to lighting in general. One thing that comes up, people talking about you need less fill now, you need less light. Some people saying, oh, you can light more now because the colorist can create all the shadows. Let's be very clear, in this type of environment, to say that you should light the way you've always lit, and that is to have the shadows where you want the shadows, have the feel for it as you would always have on 35mm, a good 35mm stock, don't worry about filling and using these little cheap LED lights to try and kick here and kick there. Because if you're using a decent enough camera like the Alexa or something like that, then we will create a much more natural feel. The audience will feel like they're there. We don't live in a world where we're surrounded like we are here with loads and loads of lights. So we mustn't start thinking that you can underlight everything, because then you'll get no shadows and it will just be murky and it will get noisy. But don't also think, well, you know, the colorist, I mean, you get certain DPs who just say, this is not at the high end, I hasten to add. He'll just, because I hate doing this, you know, we'll just fill it and you could just take it all down. Terrible, because I can never get it to look natural, because I can't take away the shadows. You know, I've got this horrible shadow here.
Exactly.
That doesn't happen in real life. So I think just because there is more lighting, more cheap, affordable lighting, doesn't mean that you should compromise on the decisions you make with a key light and having the odd little bounce spots.
Well, there's certainly a lot of confusion.
I think this is a huge point. I think people believe they can add more data, and that later, that if they add more pixels, they actually have more color information. And that's absolutely not true.
That's right.
The relationship of light and of the subject, it's captured at the time of the original image. And it doesn't matter how many pixels you have. If the right relationship of lighting isn't there and color isn't there, you can't fix it in post-production. I mean, unless you end up airbrushing, basically.
And we have shapes and vignettes.
Exactly.
I end up having to overly grade anything that has been overly lit.
Yes.
Because I end up with 10 layers, and then I start doing this and moving my arms around, and it's horrible. And the DP doesn't really work again. So I think it comes back to, you've got to be a good, this is actually a golden age for DOPs. I think some DOPs feel like, you know, my role takes away from what they're doing. And yet actually, I've become very, very good friends with DPs because we partner together to create the best looking images. And it isn't a fight. I think that's absolute nonsense. I think if you like the way that you have been trained and the way you've always lit, then you should stay working that way, and you'll create beautiful images, and I'll just make sure that anything that was wrong, I can improve.
I couldn't agree more. That's absolutely brilliant.
And using your research and your references to try and have some sense of gauging, you know, where was the form you had here with the excellent, good, fair, you know, at least if you can start here rather than here,
you stand a chance.
You stand a chance.
Yeah. And it's not, what's interesting is it's not coming down to money. It's always easy to sit on these panels. Okay, I've named the Arri Alexa, or you know, the Sony cameras are very good, the high-end ones, and the Dragon is pretty good now as well. It's got much better latitude in the lower end. But I forgot what my point was now. Come back to me.
Anyway, well, you know, for example, I mean, the Sony FS7, for example, which has this S-Log 3 thingy gamut, which is, you know, the base ISO is 2000. It has these 14 stops of range, but you've got to expose very much into the highlights. We worked on the launch film in Japan, and the engineers were constantly filling the shadows, which took away all the soul of the image.
Yeah, and also not filling the right data.
That was a technical film, because you know, because the data is coming off the sensor and being compressed straight onto the cards.
Yes, it's true that a lot of the cine type cameras having something that resembles the cine on film curve can capture 14 and a half, maybe even 15 or even 16 stops. But the top two stops are so heavily cramped together that you can't get anything out of them. Same is true at the bottom. So you're really only talking of a core of contrast range where you can actually extract realistic information. It is really silly to talk of these high numbers of stops. They don't actually mean very much when you get down to it.
Totally agree with that.
And what's happening is that the manufacturer's telling you where you should be setting your skin tones, because the noise floor is lower, and if you underexpose, you get shadow. You know, and a lot of the kind of the work as a DP is going, well, then I'll actually just point it at the scene and kind of light it and shoot. And some of these new curves are very clever, but they need to be handled very, very carefully.
They're very complicated, actually. I mean, I get a bit frustrated with Sony, I have to say, because I don't like all these different S-log curves. I also find the red a bit frustrating. With every new revision, there's another red gamma, another red color. It gets very confusing. My point earlier was that actually you don't have to spend as much money on lighting, because what we're saying is actually there's different. It's not like we're saying like the camera, you have to buy the best camera, you have the best lighting. You know, what we've been able to say here is that actually a choice over the lighting is your decision. You don't have to suddenly go and spend more. And I'm not saying you need to buy loads of lights either, because actually that could be a problem. So I think, with regards to the cameras, it's just very important to do those tests.
You mentioned the black magic. I mean, it's a very simple solution, and it has a very pleasant image, and it's got a log curve, and you light it and put a LUT on and off you go.
The log curve isn't great. You know, I spend my whole time grading Alexa, so I'm very used to what the roll-off of that is. And as we're saying here about these cameras, that when a manufacturer will say to me at this type of event, we've got 14 stops to latitude, it really doesn't mean anything. It could be absolute nonsense, because what you actually have is when you try and grade it up is there's just nothing there, or it's just very, very noise. And they say, well, look, you can see detail there. And I'm like, well, it's terrible detail. We've got to remove it anyway. It's not important whatsoever. So you have to do camera tests, and I think, as you say, with the Blackmagic, I shot something recently, or directed something, and we ended up going with the 422 ProRes because we got everything right on set. You know, we actually backed the lights off a little bit, we changed the exposure, we got the skin tone right, and I didn't even need to grade it because I just chose Rec 709 and went for it. And I said to the DP, said, well, don't you want to work in the raw mode? This is me as someone who spends his whole time saying you should shoot in raw. I went, it looks great. I've got a Sony OLED here, which I've brought down. I'm happy with this. Just shoot it like this in Rec 709. We're not going to grade it. And so you don't always have to worry about all these S-log curves. And in visual effects, it's a nightmare because the artists have no idea what they have to transcode that back into to get it into a linear color space. It comes into a different issue. I know it's a different conversation, but there is a lot of concerns over geeky DOPs getting carried away on message boards about what bit depth and what number of stops something has, unless they have done the test themselves and they are a regular user of something like the Arri or a Sony camera, where they can say, you know what, it has these limitations, but that's it. So talk about it on a message form.
I've seen certain characters go on about how if you expose S-Log3, your skin tone's going to be set at grey point of 38%. I mean, who the hell has time to go on set and put a grey card in some numbers? It's just not the way you work.
No.
Alan, looks like you're about to jump in with some nuggets.
You said it all.
This is fantastic. Let's just talk about this, Alan. This example I want you to talk about.
Here's the horror story. This is what we started out with. It's a black actor's face lit by D65 real daylight on one side, and by a prototype luminaire with 3 LEDs, a red, a green, and a blue. No phosphors. We did this deliberately to show just how bad it gets. And that's how bad it gets.
There's a big change, It's not a great change.
Your chances of grading that are 0.
Yeah, well, you've really got to work it in there. You know, you start as a colorist, you start getting your curves out. You know, like Photoshop, and I'm sure a lot of DPs are familiar with Lightroom and even Resolve, a lot of them now. And there's, I could get there. It's just not ever going to be quite as nice, and also
it's a lot of work, and the clock's ticking at £200 an hour.
It's a compromise, and I find that with I get that with the cameras. I found that with the original Red Epic, I would have to work very cleverly, working even in red log film, to just get it looking filmic, which is what we're used to, and that is quite a difficult term to get right. Tweaking all this stuff to get it right, and it is boring, to be honest. It's boring as a colorist. I mean, it's great because you sort of go, well, look how much time you've taken, but they're like, oh, why is it taking so long to get to this result? It's a bit frustrating.
So we're running out of time. Chuck, you're here at the show with your gear. Where can people find your products here at the show?
We're at the LCA booth, Light Camera Action, and so we have a full setup there of all of our different products that people come see.
And you make a range from large lights to small stick lights?
We make a 2K equivalent, we call the HS, a 1K, and then we have a series of smaller products as well.
Fantastic. And Thomas, you're just here perusing the show, or are you here in the...
You come all the way down to the Excel Centre, you feel like you've got to
have a little look around. Exactly.
It's such a pain to get to.
And I mean, if people, where can people see your work?
Well, we're at The Look. I run a post-production company called The Look, and you can find all the information about the company at thelooklondon.com, see the show reel. And
great stuff. And Alan, where can people find your extensive information?
It's all online. It's all published.
Yeah. Is there a particular website where you can find all this published information?
Go on to Gilder Television Cameramen. Go onto their front page. Bottom left-hand corner, there is a little item called TLCI Results. Click on that, and it takes you straight there.
So it sounds like if you're in the market for some LED lights, then you would do worse than to take a look at Alan's handiwork here.
Don't print it.
Maybe you could sell it as a calendar, have it up in your bathroom, so you're on the jaw, and you can just go, Anyway, so guys, that's been a really fascinating conversation. Thank you all very much.
Pleasure.
And we'll be back very soon. We've got Photon Beard coming up next, discussing their new LED lights, and then move from traditional redheads and blondes into LEDs. So join us again soon.